positive COVID tests. Their facility is closed right now. Welcome back to The Jump. We are 4 days away from the start of the preseason. Sixers coach Doc Rivers, guys, still getting questions about his old team. The Clippers' playoff collapse, still a matter of conversation. Last week on the All the Smoke podcast, Paul George was critical of his now former coach, Doc Rivers, and how he used Paul in the offense. So during a Sixers media availability this weekend, Doc responded, quote, "Hey, listen, I enjoyed coaching him. So not a lot to say there. Ty Lue was sitting right next to me, so he better hope it's not adjustments. It's not going to be much different. Listen, we lost the game, and I think everybody needs to take ownership. Obviously, we can always do better. Players can play better. So as far as I'm concerned, I'll leave it there." Coach to coach, my friend. Fizz, what is your takeaway from Doc's words?
Okay.
Oh, no, I thought Doc handled it perfectly. You don't want to go down that rabbit hole of back and forth banter about whose fault it was and blaming each other and all that stuff. And he's right. When you lose, it's everybody. Obviously, the coach he's got that volatile gig that is often, the one that takes the scrutiny. But ultimately, everybody had a hand in going down, losing a 3-1 lead. So let's just be real about that part of it. And I think that it's important. When you're a player and you're upset about how you're being used in the moment, it's a two-way street when it comes to conversation. You got to go to the coach's office and say, hey, how can we make this better? I remember Julius Randle walking into my office when we were really struggling trying to get him, to really unleash. And he came to talk to me and we talked about how we can get him playing better basketball and how we could work together on that. It's not always the coach having to go to the player. So I just think it's not a good look for Paul George doing this publicly and putting blame just on Doc. I think that's better off said behind closed doors.
Yeah, look, Rach, when Paul made those comments last week, I think a lot of people took the stuff he said about adjustments and coaching to be the main thing. But I actually think more of what was important here is how he talked about how he was used. He said, I was used like J.J. Redick or Ray Allen. It was all pin downs. And I know that was a constant source of frustration for Paul last year. Now, when the people who do statistical analysis broke that down, it actually wasn't right. It reminded me a little of Dwight Howard when he played for the Lakers, and he said, like, I just, I need to, I don't like to just run pick and roll, et cetera. Right. And it turned out, like, when you check the stats, it's like totally not how he was used at all. But every scout I talked to, when I would say, what's going on with Paul? Like, what do you see there? The scouts who watched the Clippers play had the same opinion, which is Paul's not getting the spots and in the way that he was comfortable getting it in years past. Now, some of that's on Paul. Like, hey, you're on a different team, you're going to get the ball in a different way. Mm-hmm. But I actually think more of that is just on the idea that the Clippers did not have a true point guard on that team to organize the offense, and they still don't, frankly. And, a lot of that fell on Kawhi Leonard. A lot of that fell on just the system they were running. But they're going to have to figure that out because Paul's not comfortable in the offense that they were running last year and in the ways he was being used. And whether the statistics bear that out or not, I trust the scouts who watch them play and say, get your guy comfortable. And I think for Paul, like, if he had it to do over again, probably wouldn't have taken a shot at Doc because you don't want to take shots when the enduring image of you is hitting the side of the backboard.
Yep.
Yeah, and I piggyback that, Ramona. You need a guard or a player on the floor that understands game flow and when a guy's not engaged in the game and what he needs. And they don't have that right now. That's what makes LeBron so great is because he knows the flow of the game. I don't know how many times he came to the bench and said, hey, we got to get D-Wade a layup. We got to get Chris Bosh an open shot. We got to get Ray Allen a shot. He understood that as a player, so it never fell all on Spo to figure out how to get a guy going. They collectively did it, and he was the catalyst of that. And I don't know if they have that working for their team right now. And for PG, man, I would say stay quiet, grind, do your job. You got some baggage from other teams. Right now, Doc's a guy that's a championship coach. I would stay totally away from that kind of stuff.
Yeah, absolutely. All right, I want to move on to another former Clipper, Montrezl Harrell, the sixth man of the year, has around the country. And they're not starting from a great place. When teams started COVID testing to prepare for training camps, nearly 9% of players tested positive, a number that would be catastrophic if it continued throughout the season. So how do officials make sure it doesn't? Well, this weekend, the league dropped a 158-page memo detailing the new rules. That was an expansion on the 138-page memo they dropped last weekend. And here are some of the rules they talked about. Players and staff are no longer allowed to go to any bars, lounges, or clubs, even when they're at home and on their free time. No, quote, live entertainment either, Lou Williams, and no visits to public gyms, spas, pools. So it would seem that, say, if a player has a kid on a sports team and that team is playing this winter, the player cannot go to his kid's games. It'll be interesting to see how the league interprets that one. No indoor social gatherings that exceed 15 people either, so watch out for that Super Bowl party. And the rules get even more strict when teams are on the road. Players can't use the hotel gym, for example, unless the hotel has closed it to all other guests during the team's entire stay and sanitizes it between each use. There are rules for where and how players can eat, rules about mask wearing, testing, quarantining, and teams who break the rules, intentionally or not, the NBA says it could levy fines, suspensions, or loss of draft picks. Games could be forfeited. Individual players could see their game checks docked. And the league will also be doing unannounced spot inspections of team facilities to make sure they are in compliance too. So is all of this going to work? Yes and no. The NBA has so far been the most thoughtful sports league in America when it comes to COVID, from the experts they're working with to the protocols that they have put in place. But this is a virus that has a Rasheed Wallace-like disregard for officiating. And no matter how many rules there are, the positive tests are going to come. The games will be disrupted. So no, Toto, we're not in the bubble anymore. There are no ruby slippers to click together, just a lot of patience and a lot of crossed fingers as what could be the NBA's most chaotic season is set to begin. Coach Fizz, this is a lot. As a coach, if you were in the position of trying to manage players dealing with all this, how enforceable even are all these rules?
Well, I think you have to have those rules in place. I mean, you're trying to pull off something that's nearly impossible. So you do have to have those things in place, but you just really would hope that people would take this seriously enough that they wouldn't put themselves in those positions to jeopardize not only their health and other people's health and lives, but your profession, your craft. A lot of people are going to suffer just because of irresponsible decisions. I think that's going to be where it comes down to, is the personal responsibility of everyone doing their job to make sure that everyone stays safe. The same thing we've been asking the whole country to do, right? But I think the next step is going to be, what is the NBA going to do when a guy gets sick? How are they going to handle that? And then how are they going to track that and keep the league moving forward as they try to get 72 games accomplished? I think all of that stuff is going to be something that the league is going to have to figure out as they go. But I do think having a strict situation in place to start is the way to go. And then you can always adjust from there.
You know, Rach, I think this is going to come down to players keeping each other accountable. This is what's happened in every other sport. I remember when baseball started up and the Marlins had a big outbreak, and there were several other teams that were disrupted by it, and it almost looked like baseball wasn't going to get off the ground. And you know, I think the tipping point was really the Cleveland Indians situation, right, when you had Mike Clevenger and the other pitcher go out. And their teammates really called them out. And I remember talking to Kenley Jansen from the Dodgers at the time, and he said, you know, if we want to have a season, if we want to do any of this, like, we've got to keep ourselves accountable. And I think, you know, I've heard about this. We made fun of the snitch line, okay, in Orlando. It wasn't as necessary in Orlando, but it is very necessary going forward, right? That snitch line is going to be really important, and it's got to be coming from within, because if the league has to crack down on teams, if the league has to make an example of somebody, kind of like they did with Lou Williams, I thought in the bubble they made an example of him. We saw that in football with the Denver Broncos. They may try to make an example of those quarterbacks, but that's only going to be putting out spot fires. If you actually want this to work, it has to come from the players.
It's complicated.
How important is it to you at the end of the day?
Right, but it's complicated, guys, right? Because on the teams that are marching toward a championship, I can see players holding each other accountable. We all know what it's like in the middle of the season with a team that maybe doesn't feel like it's really in there and not everybody's rowing in the same direction. And by the way, that Cleveland Indians example, Ramona, is exactly right. And that's the thing I think of the most also. But it is different in baseball, where you have a whole rotation of pitchers, and even some of the most important players can't necessarily be replaced, but aren't as vital every day. James Harden, we just talked about in the last segment, was out in a club in a city he wasn't, according to the NBA, supposed to be in, being with people he wasn't supposed to be with, not wearing a face mask. And I don't know how things are going to feel like in the locker room when he does finally rejoin that team. But can the Rockets go out and do what they want to do this season without James Harden or whoever they trade him for to fulfill that role? No, they can't. So how much are other players in that locker room going to, quote, hold James Harden accountable? It is a very, very complicated stew. And it's just a lot of rules also. And Ramona, I haven't gotten a great answer on with a positive test. As Fizz says, we read the protocols and the 10-day quarantine and the 2 negative tests to come back and all of that. But what have you heard about how the schedule is going to change? Because if someone comes with a positive test on a Monday, even if he is isolated immediately, what are they going to do about the team that he played on Saturday night or Sunday afternoon, and the 2 teams that team is supposed to play the following next day or the day after that when they try to get 3 or 4 games a week?
Yeah, I mean, that's going to be the big question going forward, because, you know, in the NFL, you can isolate close contacts and you have all week to do it. You have the benefit of time. In the NBA, you don't have that. And they've tried to mitigate this a little bit by having more of a baseball schedule where you have sort of 2 games back to back. So theoretically, it would only be 1 team that you played. So you're not going to have every night a new team that we're worried about. But I just think back on that night when Rudy Gobert tested positive, March 11th, where somebody put this graphic up on Twitter of like how many teams the Jazz had played in the last 14 days and how many teams those teams had played in the last 14 days. And it was basically the whole league. Right. So, I mean, this is a house of cards. And, you know, if you think about the way that the nature of how this is structured. Now, I'll tell you this. I know one team that has been dealing with this, and because of HIPAA laws, I can't say which player it is. But this team, you know, there was a player that tested positive that had like practiced with some teammates, and they've kind of been sweating it out this week to see if any more of them, this is away from the court, but they sweating it out to see if any more of them test positive. Turns out they're all okay. Everybody was fine. But what the NBA is hoping is that this little onboarding process is what's going to get all the positive tests, and you're not going to see, 9% again. Like they're hoping they got their 9% out of the way.
Yeah, absolutely. And we still don't know really. The medical community doesn't know enough concretely about the reinfection rate and whether and how long you have immunity, autoimmunity from that. So we don't know if, quote, getting out of the way means that a lot of those